First of all, my two colleagues here, Jerry and Monique Sternin, were the real pioneers of the work I'm going to talk about today, and I was sort of the Boswell involved in a few of these activities, but they are really the ones that took this work forward. And the second thing I wanted to say is, just as an opening for context, how many of you attended that American Dream session where they had all the charts on the survey results of how Americans feel about the likelihood of realizing the American dream? Anybody in the room? Okay. Well, I want to just flag this as something to have in the back of your mind in the course of this conversation. The, to me, very surprising result of that data, which is, I guess, accessible through the Atlantic Monthly's website, and I encourage you all to look at it, is these astonishing data that, notwithstanding age, race, and socioeconomic class, something like 75 to 80% of all Americans, being aware of how screwed up things are, believe that they personally can realize the American dream. And this is just so counter to what I would have expected and what the surveyors expected. This was Mark Penn and Don Baer, and it's a very thorough work, it appeared, that came out in that survey. So why I point that out to you is that if indeed individuals, notwithstanding their age, socioeconomic status, or race, believe they personally can live the dream, that, to me, poses an opportunity for leadership, where people are individually hopeful, notwithstanding a context that they worry about a great deal. Now, I make that distinction because the premise that would then follow from a leadership point of view is that this is what we call an asset-based assumption, rather than a deficit-based assumption. Now, having attended a number of programs here, I would say, by and large, the Aspen agenda is deficit-based. In other words, the call to action, appropriately, is that the glass is half empty, and we need to do something about it. And the way you try to get change to happen as a leader is you have two choices. You frame the challenge as a threat that needs to be addressed, or as an opportunity. So I point that out because the premise of positive deviance is asset-based. And that paradigm, being aware of those two choices we make to provoke change, is a fundamental assumption, and often they're invisible to us because we just typically default toward one or the other. And I just want you to be aware today that that is a fundamental assumption here in the stuff you're going to hear about. Okay? Point this in the right place. Okay, so this guy, Nasruddin, is a fixture of 13th century Middle Eastern folklore. He shows up in a lot of parables, and in this particular one, he is a fellow in the business of transporting produce from Saudi Arabia to arid Yemen. And he's just bringing melons and fruits and vegetables into Yemen, where he sells them and returns home. The only thing that kind of puzzles his Saudi customs officials and folks in government is why this guy is growing in wealth in leaps and bounds, well beyond what one would expect from the cash flow of the produce logistics business. So they start to really be rigorous in searching what the hell he's smuggling. And they're checking out the saddlebags, looking in the mouths of the camels, the hooves. Where's he hiding this stuff? And they never find anything. So the years go by. He retires as a very wealthy man. One day in the tea house, he's sitting enjoying his tea, and the now retired customs inspector joins him and says, Nasruddin, you know, I'm out of the business of being an official for the government. I'm not going to prosecute you, and you're retired. Talk to me. What in God's name were you smuggling? His answer was camels. Okay? So this idea of what's invisible in plain sight is the premise of positive deviance, and that's what it will talk about. So there are 3 or 4 things to say about positive deviance. First of all, it's a kind of an oxymoronic, awkward term. In fact, we've fought hard and long about whether to change it. But it's a really simple idea, which is look for outliers who are succeeding against all odds. Okay? Now, we've all heard this say many times, and I think many of you work in a world in which you hear this, we've tried everything and nothing works. And the premise here is that in every situation, almost every situation, I suppose I should say, there usually is an individual or two who, with the same resources as everyone else, is succeeding when others don't. And again, with that asset-based assumption, the question is, what's that person up to that lets them prevail when others struggle? Okay? Now, the interesting thing about positive deviants is they typically don't know what they know. In other words, they're doing something that's working, and they're not even aware that they're getting better outcomes because they're just doing what they do. Or what they're doing is so countercultural that they don't want to own up to what they're doing. They just want to stay below the radar. So what makes it a little bit tricky is these folks either don't single themselves out as being special, or they don't want to single themselves out as special, right? So what we're saying here is that from a statistical sense, there are people who are deviant in the positive direction, and the task for the community is to figure out who these people are, what they're doing, and to engage in tapping the wisdom in their own midst. But that word community is a key word in this, because the difference between this idea and best practices, and they're seductively similar, but they're really not, is that best practices are I figure it out or somebody does, and then we tell you, hey, get your act together, this is the way to do it. And for certain things, that's a great solution. But often, challenges that involve behavioral and social and community change, you need to engage the people with the problem to be part of solving the problem. And again, I thought an asset-based approach that we heard yesterday with Ram, Emmanuel talking about the Chicago school system, was very much, I would say, more asset-based and looking for people with the problem to help solve the problem. It had that tilt to it, just again to distinguish the different assumptions of change that go on here. Now, let me just say one last thing. The conditions under which positive deviance makes sense have to meet these, in my view, these criteria. First of all, you've tried everything and nothing works. It's the remedy of last resort. Secondly, the change that needs to take place is one which involves behavioral, cultural, social change. If it's technical, if it's a Salk vaccine and the problem is polio, you do not need to engage a community if you've got the silver bullet, and you shouldn't. But when the problem is deeper and the issues of adaptation requires a community to really embrace it, again, I think Ram's talk yesterday was very illustrative of the issues in Chicago in this regard. You can't just impose it top down. You've really got to get the people in the game with you, okay? So I'm going to give you, rather rapidly here, I'm afraid, 4 or 5 little stories. And they're stories of increasing complexity. So what starts out is like, oh, wow, that's obvious. We should do more of this. I think as I go forward, you're going to say, whoops, this is harder, not impossible, but harder than it looks. So the intent of these, if I can get through these 3 or 4 stories, will, I think, start to hopefully provoke some good conversation in the room. So this all starts in Vietnam. And in the 1980s, after the Vietnam War ends, a couple things happen to Vietnam that were unexpected. First, Russia starts to collapse. The Soviet Union starts to collapse. And secondly, they get in a fight with China over territory, which you may recall. So abruptly, the 2 major suppliers of rice stop sending rice to Vietnam. And Vietnam, having been dependent on all this essentially free rice, suddenly privatizes the rice growing business because there was nothing to provide rice otherwise than to turn it back to the people. And they undergo, by the mid-'80s, severe famine, like almost North Korea-size famine. And by 1989, something like 86% of all rural Vietnamese children are malnourished. Now, a little morbid after breakfast, but whoops, let's go back. So in a few words, malnutrition is nasty. And there's acute and chronic, and briefly, this is short-term, where you might be full from calories, but you're not getting all the nutrients your body needs, and so your body starts to kind of work to preserve itself, and you start to see the accumulation, particularly of liquids, with a distended belly, swollen feet. When you touch the foot of a malnourished child, it's like touching Play-Doh. It doesn't bounce back. And if it goes on for a long while, you get chronic malnutrition, which is where the body is really starting to eat itself to keep the vital organs going. And so the skin dries up, gets like parchment, all those endearing facial expressions of characteristics of a child sort of shrink to the skull. It's really any of you that have dealt with this, harsh thing to behold. Cavernous eyes, big eyes out of cavernous sockets, and you're very, very vulnerable to disease and then death. And all of these things have the effect for a peasant community, as in rural Vietnam, of stunting, and human beings who, if they survive to adulthood, are both limited physically and intellectually to do the work. So it's a really crippling problem. Imagine something like 2/3 of your kids suffering from this. So in desperation, the Ministry of Health, having tried UNICEF and WHO, who come in with food or something, and then as soon as they stop providing that, and by the way, kids bounce back at the age from 4 and below very quickly when you start to provide the right nutrients and food. But as soon as they withdraw those resources, if it's not sustainable, they go right back to where they started. And they had observed in Vietnam this happening again and again, so they turn, and I could assure you in desperation, to Save the Children US. And these two characters, Jerry and Monique Sternin, are the 7th and 8th Americans to get a visa to Vietnam. They're welcomed by the Minister of Health that says, the good news is you're here, and I'm hoping you can come up with a sustainable answer to this. The bad is many of my colleagues believe you're from the CIA. No fooling. And you've got a 6-month visa, and if you can't get progress in that time, you're out of here. Now, any of you that have worked in the developing world, it takes 6 months to get a car, an office, a phone that works, and a translator. Trying to do anything in 6 months in a developing world is like, are you kidding? So these two colleagues of mine are told, and you're going to go to this remote part of Vietnam, about 4 hours torturous drive south of Hanoi. We're going to give you 3 districts, see what you could do. And necessity being the mother of invention, they remember from Harvard this research concept, not a method, that tried to explain these oddball findings you occasionally run into when you're doing research of something that shouldn't happen but is happening and positive, and the term was positive deviance. And that's where this horrible term comes from as a statistical term for oddball research findings. And they said, what if there were those kind of people in these communities? Now, the very good news about malnutrition, unlike a lot of the stories I'm going to tell you, is that every parent wants their kid to be normal. So if you go in and say, look, we're here to try to assist you, and the only way we can begin is by weighing your kid to see if they're normal for their age and sex, and we're talking again about kids under 4, everybody signs up for that. You don't have to sell that idea, as you see. And having done this, and there was like 95% turnout, they then, and this is a mock-up of the real thing, because the real thing wasn't nearly as this nice, was a black piece of plywood with soft stone as the chalk. And they list the name of their kids, their age, their sex, their weight. And then we said, okay, now tell us what the socioeconomic class is of these children. And they came up with 3 categories: poor, very poor, and very, very poor. which is something to do with those words on the right. And one of the fascinating things about this asset-based approach is when someone makes a generalization, it is hopeless for a black 16-year-old boy to survive in this neighborhood. And you say, so absolutely no kid at that age in this ghetto has ever made it out. We call it turning it on its head. You kind of use judo on the assertion. Absolutely no one ever. Well, actually maybe. Well, the beauty of this, and again, using data, was people looked at this list, and you had the entire village showing up to look at these results, is they see a few names up here of very, very poor kids who are normal, which is one of the ways you begin the question that, again, engages the community in how can you explain that. Not the experts, but the community. Crucial to what you're going to hear me talk about. And on the basis of this, they go out and do two things. First, again, the community goes out in groups, and they talk to everybody about what are the common practices for feeding our kids to create the baseline. And one of the kind of asides that I think is worth making is that about the fifth focus group, you're at the 80-20 rule or beyond, where you're saying, I'm hearing the same thing over and over again. And quite wisely, because we were learning a lot as we went, the folks involved said, yeah, but you can't stop. It's important that everybody in the village be part of a focus group because the questions are part of engaging them in what we're trying to solve for. And along the way, they start picking up some of these oddball practices, which turn out to be these three things. So in this particular village, they discovered that parents of well-nourished children were doing a couple things. They actually, in addition to this, they were feeding their kids multiple times a day, not just before they went out to the rice fields and came back by using the siblings. But secondly, they were feeding them extra nutrients in addition to rice. So they'd go out into the rice paddies and get freely available, looks exotic here, shrimps, crabs, and greens, but this would be the equivalent of you giving your kid earthworms and snails and dandelions. I mean, most of you, if you were doing that, might not be telling your neighbor, because that's just not cool. You don't do that to children. These things are seen as highly unsuitable for giving children, but that's what these families were doing. And obviously, these are resources available to everyone. So there's this great aha, wow, these are things we could all do. Then something quite serendipitous occurred. Jerry and Monique have this wonderful aha, isn't this cool? The village is really into this, they're really discovering it. They're stuck in a traffic jam among bicycles and ox carts heading back to Hanoi, and they're just dying as experts to broadcast the silver bullet to malnutrition in this particular village. And they remember an older woman saying in Vietnamese the following, that 1,000 hearings is worth one seeing, and 1,000 seeings is worth one doing. And they say, we're about to do what experts do. Think of your own work in this respect. We're about to go out and tell people what they should do. What if we turn back to the villagers and say, okay, now that you've discovered this, what's the best way to make it happen? And they came up with an ingenious, this is not Jerry and Monique, this is the villagers' idea of these feeding workshops. They said, look, if you will bribe people to come with Save the Children's resources with an egg and tofu for the kid, we will have little groups of mothers getting together, and here's the deal. They're going to bring their kids every day for 2 weeks. They get the egg and tofu, but the price of admission is a handful of greens and a handful of crabs and shrimps, and you got to get your kids to eat it. Now, those of you with young children can imagine how much fun it is to feed your child snails and earthworms and weeds. That's not an easy sell, but the mothers show up, and this is highly successful. Within 2 weeks, they weigh them again. Some graduate, some come back a month later for part 2, part 3, and within about 5.5 months into this, the Ministry of Health shows up with their white coats, looking like the FDA on steroids, to test whether anything was going on in this village. And this is what the data looked like. And more exciting was that, so this is like this is 5 months into 91. In 94, the Harvard School of Public Health comes back to this village and other villages and sees what's happened since. And what was really wonderful is that these numbers have just gotten better and better. But better yet, unborn children at the time of Jerry and Monique's work were now routinely eating shrimp, crabs, and greens. And over the course of this work, by the mid-90s, you've got 22 provinces with 3.2 million people, and malnutrition has gone from that high 65% down to the low double digits, like 10, 12%. Big change. So you say, wow, this is cool. Good idea, we should do this. Next stop was Bolivia. I'll make this very fast, where the people had heard about the work in Vietnam. They invited us to come and see what we could do, but they said, look, don't waste your time, and by the way, our money, by finding out what people are eating, because we know what they're eating. The Cachucha Indians in Altipano of Bolivia were suffering from stunting, and we can tell you that every family eats the same thing. It's a big kettle with 6 or 8 carrots, potatoes, and fish broth, and they all get a ladle full of this stuff per person, and that's what they do. And you're going to waste time studying this, so the same kind of process of getting the community involved in the question occurs, and the people go out, and indeed that's exactly what seems to be happening. Fortunately, one of the people on the groups observing from La Paz says, I'm noticing something. The families where the kids are not stunted are doing something different with a ladle. What I observe is that most of the time the children get ladled from the top of the pot, whereas the adults, they scoop down to the bottom. And that was not by accident. The adults who are out there doing hard work are getting the extra calories and protein to do the work. So there was an intentional cultural, perhaps invisible, assumption of why you would do what you did. Well, this is where this how versus what becomes important. And indeed, I think in Vietnam that was true as well. It wasn't just the what of shrimps, crabs, and greens. It was the how you got mothers used to and children used to eating different things. In this case, the how was the ladle from the bottom for everybody, not just for the adults. So that was sort of the aha from Bolivia. Briefly in Argentina, we started for the first time to run into a problem where people didn't want us there. So in Misiones province, in the northernmost part of Argentina, you had school teachers who, owing to the ineptitude of the Ministry of Education, had not been paid for 3 months. They'd been told by their principal, well, of course, the World Bank had sponsored this project, and they'd been coerced to come on a Saturday to show up to hear about positive deviance. We had a room full of people with arms closed who were very pissed off. You could just feel this room antagonistically disposed toward this matter. So this is not mothers wanting their kids to be healthy. This is teachers saying, why in the hell am I spending a Saturday hearing about something in Vietnam? And indeed, we didn't get past the first 5 minutes before they were standing up and objecting in a very impassioned Latin way to how we were wasting their time. And we said, look, you only got a couple hours to put up with this, but we'd just like to tell you about these ideas. Clearly, these ideas that work elsewhere don't work here. The whole idea of essentially positive deviance is it's discovering your own wisdom, but we're going to give you some data. We've got coded data from the 122 schools in Misiones province where we know that you're getting a 56% retention rate through 6th grade, whereas Argentina, on average, is 86%. So you're way below the national average. And the explanation in the room was, yeah, because you don't deal with the kind of people we have in our remote province up near Brazil, where these are migrants, some of them from Eastern Europe, many of them illiterate, who have zero interest in school and want their kids out in the field helping them, collect whatever food they can to survive. So they get the data, and again, it's coded, and to their amazement, Out of these 120 schools, there's 3 or 4 with 100% retention through 6th grade, a number at 90%. And you get these groups of teachers saying, how in God's name can these schools in our province get this disparate stuff? So using data again, as we did throughout this process, you start to look at those generalizations that don't seem to hold for everybody, which is the key. But again, part of the key is getting the community to be curious about the problem. That's crucial to this process. And to make a very long story short, as they get into it, they start inviting the parents in, which adds a whole new voice, and the parents were, in many cases, flattered to be there, but their relationship with, in fact, the woman in the front row here is the teacher with her white frock, which is how they dressed up like doctors in a hospital, because that was their status, getting the parents and the teachers to start going out and discovering what was going on. And the outcome of this was that in the schools that were doing well, you basically had the teachers often going out on horseback to these really remote areas, meeting with the parents and saying, we'll make a deal with you. If we can get your kid by 3rd grade to read, write, and add and subtract, you will protect yourself from the ability of the store and other sources of interaction with the government to take advantage of you. And indeed, there are government subsidies and things you're not even aware of, but your child could actually be quite helpful. And they actually, for some reason unique to Argentina, had contracts with these parents. So suddenly the parents become partners, again, Ram's conversation yesterday, in the work. And for the districts that participated in this, we dropped the problem of, we doubled the ability to retain kids within a couple years in Argentina. But this is the first time we ran into the problem of people not wanting initially to learn about what we had to offer. Okay, now 2 quick and quite complicated stories. The VA hospital system, 42 hospitals around the United States, along with many other hospitals in the United States, deals with a problem that we read about but don't really fully fathom. And it has to do with this stuff, MRSA, multi-resistant staph. So effectively, this is a biological weapon that's cultivated in hospitals that, despite everything hospitals does, has morphed and mutated in a way to defy all known antibiotics, okay? And the scary part about this is when that happens, and 300 people are killed when Air Malaysia goes down, the world is in a complete outcry. That's happening every week in America owing to MRSA. 19,000 Americans will die from MRSA acquired in a hospital. And 100,000 will have serious stays in a hospital in order to eliminate this disease. So it's a catastrophic disease. But I promise you, if you have any reason to visit a hospital and you say to them, what about this MRSA thing, 19,000 people? Most often they will say, well, it's bad, but it's a hospital. You know, this is a hospital. You know, we're dealing with all sorts of stuff here. You gotta, it's part of what comes with the territory. So it's in the example, we've tried everything and nothing works, and the resignation that many of us face in our worlds where people are just, that's just the way it is, okay? So some of the statistics, and the really troublesome one here is that, you know, since about 1850, we have known how to deal with this. It's called hand washing and a bunch of activities that you engage in to completely completely sanitary with respect to not carrying the disease around. And every year, the CDC, the Center of Disease Control, requires that everybody in a hospital take a course, sign a statement that they will do all these wonderful things. The adherence rate, based on the CDC numbers, is between 26 and 48%. So notwithstanding we know what to do, we don't do it. Just to let you know, in Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, MRSA is non-existent. And if any of you have the misfortune to show up at a hospital in one of those countries, they will treat you as if you have Ebola as an American. Honest to God. I mean, they will say, oh, wow, an American. They will, because they say you often carry it, you don't know you've got it, and we will treat you as if you have a very, very dangerous disease, which you might. So there are countries that have solved for this. We haven't. So in the VA system, again, making this a very short story, whoops, there was an epidemic, as the earlier, I'm going the wrong way here, statistics show where it had gone from practically nothing to in the order of those kind of numbers in a period of 20 years. And again, just accepted as just the way it is. And they, after having tried everything, turned to this idea of positive deviance, and again, doing a disservice to a complicated process. They look for ways to invite hospital folks into a big room. They talk about Vietnam and Bolivia and Argentina, and they say, any of you interested in whether this idea might have some relevance, because there's a couple wards in our hospital that have a much better rate of avoiding MRSA than everybody else. Is anybody curious about this? About 100 people show up the next day. They start having discussions. And one of the things we've learned about this stuff, as many of you have probably learned, is that if you can make it visual and visceral, you start to socialize what data means. So one of the great things they came up with is they got a volunteer, one of the nurses, to pretend to be a patient. They put a big pile of pudding, chocolate pudding, on her leg as if it were a injury. And so Lisa over here on the right, you see this pudding, is doing what a patient might do, is she scratches her wound and then she pushes her hair back, and her mom sitting there caresses her head and gets pudding on her hand. The nurse walks in. Mom shakes the nurse's hand. The nurse is now touching the stethoscope, the pillow, the bed, the IV. Pretty soon, you've got this stuff now over the doorknobs and the bed. Then the tech shows up for the blood sample and gets it on him. The doctor shows up and gets it on him. And pretty soon, people in the room observing the simulation say, oh my God, everybody's got pudding on them. This is how this stuff spreads. So again, being fairly short to this story, another great thing they did is they got 19,000 pieces of macaroni from Costco. They put them on a gurney, and every time there was a meeting like this, they'd roll the gurney in, they'd pick this up and drop it and say, this is what we're doing in the United States. Every one of these is a dead person within the next 12 months. This is what this means. So if you can find ways of making data real, it's quite important in this, to engage the community. Well, the short answer is getting this whole hospital involved, these are CDC numbers, drives down the ICU numbers are in, I guess, orange, and the non-ICU in blue, but a dramatic decrease within the VA system. And the things that were cool about this, again, when you get the community involved, is you have the ministers and priests realizing that the Bible is a vector. And going from bed to bed, not knowing who's got MRSA and not, you're basically spreading it around. The docs, who are the worst offenders, typically maybe wash their hands going in and not going out. Their tie is a vector. The guy that runs the physical therapy room for people that are starting to be rehabilitated starts to look at his own equipment and people on those machines and what's happening to their hands. The woman that runs the rec program with the bingo at night starts to seeing what's going on in the bingo room as people handle the chips. So you get the unusual the bus driver says, my God, people are getting on and off the bus, getting around the hospital, the VA grounds. What's happening here? And to me, the coolest part of this is by getting the whole system involved in this. The most unlikely of all people, the patient, becomes a stakeholder. And the patients say, look, if this is so important, get the soap dispenser so I can see it. So I can tell when people coming in and out of here are washing their hands. And you start to engage the patients as part of the advocacy for adhering to these procedures that everyone should follow and don't. a big success. This moves from the Pittsburgh hospital around the VA system within about 4 years, again, with each hospital having to opt in to whether they want to do it or not. But I think eventually the normative effects make it almost compulsory. So opt-in is a bit of a misnomer eventually. And pretty soon within the VA system, we've had this remarkable result. I think I have time for one more. Any of you in the tent the other day to hear Sue Hellman, Gates Foundation, talk about the ice cube? Okay, so this is like an impossible problem. She just gave you the simplest part of it, which is how do you take a vaccine that has to be kept colder than ice, colder than 32 degrees, and keep it in that condition until it's actually administered? That alone is nasty. And what Gavi, she mentioned the Global Alliance for Vaccines, is up to is to try to, having in the last 5 years gotten to about 80% of all children in the developed world with the first vaccinations against the major childhood killers like measles and rubella and polio and so forth, to actually come up in the next 5 years with an immunization system that can track each child, many of them in remote locations, and know that that child needs a booster shot for hepatitis or cholera or whatever it is, because a lot of vaccinations are not once and for all. You have to do them multiple times. This is really, when you think about it, like an impossible problem. So very briefly, a woman here, American woman in an NGO, familiar with positive deviance, looking at, in this case, at Punjab, Pakistan, says, what can we do about this? And when you deal with positive deviance, I promised it to you to get more complicated, you look at all of the different factors that need to be tackled, and there are a lot of them, and you ask the question, which of these are beyond just a technical fix? Which of these require cultural behavioral change? And one of the interesting findings here, as she got together with the managers and some of the vaccinators, these are many of these people are sort of middle age and beyond, is that these vaccinators who joined in the work of vaccinating children with great hope and conviction maybe 20 years earlier were now extremely resigned and demoralized. Why? Because they were often not paid their full salary because their bosses were skimming their paychecks. They in particular were being abused because they drive around to really bad places on bad roads, and the bosses basically took their fuel allowances and repair allowances, and any of you driven around in these places know your vehicles fall apart a lot, and misuse those funds. And so they were basically stymied from really doing the work, and often had part-time jobs because they couldn't do what they were supposed to be doing. In the course of, again, making a long story short, these conversations, some of the folks that were doing better were saying, well, at least one thing we do that helps us out is we all have our phones and we talk to each other like a community of practice. Hey, my radiator just blew up. Do you have anybody anywhere where you are that has an extra radiator because I can't get my vehicle to work? And they said, somewhere in passing, phones can be used to pay people. Phones can be used at gas stations to get your fuel allowance. Why are you filtering through this corrupt bureaucracy when you can get to us directly? And with this simple, now this is a technical solution, a brilliant technical solution, sort of right like the camels right in front of your eyes, except the social solution was getting the wisdom from this community to say, and by the way, we're not really welcoming this, but once you have that phone, and we all have them, you can know where we are, exactly where we are. You can actually have us take pictures of the vial of vaccine to see if it's been ruined by breaking the cold chain. We can have interviews with the head of school to see if we're actually out there doing what we're supposed to be doing. We can get pictures of the children. And by virtue of this simple device and 3,500 of these Android phones being administered in Pakistan last year, between late 2014 and today, addressing this on multiple fronts, and again, using data, we've moved from the red, which is where we were, to the green. This is in a year. Now, when you can take a problem as hairy as immunization system and kind of use the wisdom of a community, I think that's an astonishing truth. And again, the beauty of this is there's a technical silver bullet that we just didn't know how to exploit, using it for any number of very good reasons that will probably alter our ability with the Gates work in Gavi to get a lot done in the next 5 years. Not everywhere, but in a lot of places. All right. I'm not going to, I need to give you guys some time with 5 minutes remaining to ask questions. This is a short story about Merck, a big company with a very sort of classic command and control approach that had a Latin America business where Mexico was at the bottom of all 41 countries in selling a very important product called Fosamax and osteoporosis. Help me here. Thank you. I hope everybody heard that. I won't even try. And it was coming off patent, and Mexico was under a lot of pressure because they were doing a very bad job of it. Using this approach with their sales force, they were able to move in a year and a half from the bottom to the top by really paying attention to what the PD salesmen were doing, which was, to cut ahead to the story, breaking the rules. So the two things that Merck said you had to do, which is use your BlackBerry to report on what you were selling and call on 7 customers a day, were being defied by the successful salespeople. And by virtue of simply putting that under the microscope, questioning it, and altering the way in which the sales force, 224 salespeople in Mexico worked, they changed that around. The perverse part of this story is that when this man who led the charge on this remarkable change was moved to Brazil, we never saw any sign of ever trying this again. And so one of the great questions, and always one that perplexes me, is why are companies the hardest place in the world? I have an answer for that, but why are companies the hardest place in the world for positive deviance to actually be put to use? I will stop with that and let you. Why are companies? Oh, did I set you up for that question? I think there's 2 reasons. First of all, I think if you had a continuum between like civil society, maybe hospitals and NGOs in the middle, and companies on the far side, a well-run, typically run corporation really makes great use of these powerful tools, pay for performance, all the metrics, tracking variances, and essentially we really fence in and control for the behavior we want to a much greater degree than I think is true of other institutions. And the second part, I think in particular for companies, is that you sign a psychological contract, which says in return for some kind of job security and maybe the business card and the legitimacy of working for you, I will give up a certain amount of volition of exercising my own judgment in the way I think things should be done. When you ask people what % of their full potential is used on a job, the answer is 20%. If you ask people, can you see lots of ways of improving things around here, the number is a very high number. But companies basically trade away your exercise of that capacity in favor of the other things you get in return. That's a shot. Other question? Yes.
Yeah, just a quick comment and then a question. Just for everyone here, I don't think this is on, right? I'm a survivor of MRSA pneumonia, and it's interesting, just so you know, on doctors, the place where MRSA is found the most is on stethoscopes. I don't think any of you have ever had a doctor clean their stethoscope before using it on you. And on airplanes, it's not in the laboratories, it's the tray table, so just keep that in mind. Question, the difference, I'm not quite understanding the nuances of the difference between best practices, which are usually based on finding successful outliers and then giving that advice to the rest of the group, and positive deviance.
Yeah. Okay. They both use data. They both require sponsorship, and we haven't talked about that, but sponsorship is crucial. The difference is that if you come to the conclusion that the problem to be solved involves the a change in the social system, in the culture of the organization, changes of attitudes and behavior, the imposition of somebody else's answer on me is typically not invented here, you're different, I like what you're doing, but we don't do that. So people make up all sorts of reasons when the answer, again, if it affects attitudes, behavior, culture, things that are not easy to change. Now, if it's a silver bullet, if it's a Salk vaccine, and it works here, and it's a simple, sugar pill, I'm not going to fight that. That doesn't really, except for a few places where there's superstitions about this, you basically don't have a fight. But if people have to change themselves, getting people in the game and having them, crucially, opt in. So in all of these stories, the general rule is you put an issue out there, like the macaroni, the horrible statistics, and say, is anyone interested in explaining why 2 wards don't have this problem and the rest of us do? People have to show up the next day and be part of the work. Now, I don't think, and when the VA spread this around, they didn't do what you would think the VA would do, is say, they did this in Pittsburgh, go do it. They realized from the Pittsburgh experience, people had to decide if they wanted in the game. And that is a crucial difference that we typically have a very hard time coming to terms with. Yes? So we'll take one more question.
Have you ever been asked to apply this to the number of gun deaths in the United States? Like 30,000 a year?
No.
No, 30,000? Yeah. No.
We've dealt with gang violence in Pittsburgh, but not with that specific issue. And when we tried to tackle it, the problem the community wanted to solve was how do we get safe coming to and from school, not what the sponsor wanted to solve, which was violence, gun violence. And so you have to listen to the community and their question, not necessarily the sponsor's question. Okay, everyone, I appreciate the brave people that showed up. Thanks.